Okay. So speaking of sort of theories, right? We've talked a lot about different types of theories, and this is another theory that I wanted us to discuss is racial triangulation, the racial triangulations of Asian Americans. Okay. And this is an important piece, although it's, you can critically look at it, right? And this is by a professor, Claire Jean Kim. And to get us started, the article that I have listed here is an article that mentions the Asian American police officer that was charged with the murder of George Floyd, right? So we have Tao, right, who was Hmong, right? So this is actually in Minnesota, right? That happens, right? And so when we're talking about Tao and sort of his involvement with the death of George Floyd, it kind of puts an interesting dynamic into this whole notion of the black-white paradigm, right? And where do the Asians fit, right? And so these are some of the quotes that are from the article. So Tao, who has a history of being involved in the use of force incidents, is being described by activists as a symbol of Asian American complicity and anti-blackness following the death of George Floyd. A black man who begged for his life while then Officer Derek Chauvin dug his knee into his neck for more than 8 minutes. Several experts express that this is a pivotal moment for Asian Americans to tackle the subject of anti-blackness in a productive way, beginning with their own communities by first confronting, right, a confrontation with the historical context behind it, right? So they're kind of presenting, Tao as being sort of anti-black and as a representative of being like an Asian, so therefore somehow making him seem as though he's the representative of how Asian American community is essentially anti-black or something like that, right? And I think that alone, this article I think is very problematic, right? Because it presents, this hateful crime and sort of pits the Asian, right, against the black body, without really owning up to the fact of who actually did the murder, right? Which is Derek Chauvin, a white police officer, right? So when we think about this, I wanted us to sort of break down what a social theory is. What is theory, right? It's intended to explain and analyze objects of social reality. So something like racism, right, is something that is theoretical, right? It's something that is people are trying to understand why racism happens, right? Or inequality happens, or crime, right? That's a social reality. Or why do teenage pregnancies happen, right? And so there you do these studies and then you come up with your understanding of that social reality, whether it's the Professor Taka's social theory of blah, 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 right? And so that's what a theory is, right? It connects the individual in order to organize and substantiate sociological or social knowledge, right? So we're trying to make these connections, right? And you can make these connections through ethnic studies scholarships, through different types of scholarship, right? It's not just like limited to racism and whatnot, right? But you can talk about gender, sex. You can talk about all these different sort of aspects of our social reality, and that's what researchers come up with and sort of create a social theory. Okay, so with that in mind, we want to think about how Kim, right, the author of Racial Triangulation of Asian Americans, is really trying to set that up for us, right? What her research, right, what Dr. Kim's research provides for us in terms of understanding that relationship of being Asian American and how it relates to being white and how it relates to being black, right? And what her understanding is of this, right? So it's a racial thinking, right? And it's conditioned by, and one of the things that sort of Kim kind of brings to the table is the conditioning by European ethnological frameworks. We're talking about ethnologies is the study of different people, right? And it's usually definable through visual representation, right? When you're talking about visual representations, we're talking about skin color, right? talking about physical markers, right? And what happens is you have these sort of white opinion makers that sort of construct these theories. And this is how social theory even began, early on, right? So when we're talking about someone like Marx or something like that, he's talking about inequality, right? But he's talking about it through this European, right, perspective, through this white perspective, right? And so they're constructing these theories and maybe negating the fact that maybe race isn't included in it. Or you have these theories about how certain races are inferior or superior, etc. Okay. So these are these distinct and independent group trajectories for each race. And this is how a social theory came to be through this European perspective. Okay. Now, when you have racial theory that's being constructed, right, it usually becomes this black and white thing, right? It's a black and white sort of what we discuss as a binary, right? It's either black and it's either white. And that was the big sort of challenge, right? Is you have this influx of new immigrants coming in and you're like, are they black? Are they white? What are we going to do? And so you had all these Supreme Court trials, you had these Superior Court trials that kind of tried to frame, not only Asians, but, Mexican, Latin American folks too, as well. So then what you have is this racialization process that's mutually constitutive of one another and how they can unfold along more than one dimension or scale at a time. So what Kim is trying to present to us is how racialization happens, but it doesn't happen necessarily, through a binary, but maybe these are sort of mutually exclusive or constitutive, right? And it's like not just sort of this one-dimensional scale, right? And sort of Kim poses how there's this field of racial position, right? Or to move the conception of racial dynamics beyond the black and white. So we're not just talking about black or white, we're talking about maybe there's some sort of scaling that can happen, right? So Asian Americans in particular are racially triangulated vis-a-vis the black and the white, okay? The black and the white. And so when you have this racial positioning, where do the Asians fit? That's what the project is that Kim is trying to theorize, right? Through her study. Okay. So with Kim's claims, you have public discourse. So the public, right? These arguments that the people are making out in public about racial groups and their relative status generates a field of racial position. Okay, so you have these things that are made, right, cultivated by major opinion makers, which reinforces white dominance. And who are some major opinion makers? We're talking like newspaper folks, we're talking politicians, right, media. These people are then saying, hey, well, we are the dominant race, not the Asians, obviously, not the blacks, obviously, right? And so, right, so you have this thing that is defined as both superior slash inferior slash insider slash foreigner, right? So then again, puts it into a binary, right? Who's superior, right? The white. Who's inferior? Black. Who's insider, right? White. Who's foreigner? In this case, it would be Asian, right? So you have sort of Asians then have been racially triangulated vis-a-vis blacks and whites. So you have the relative valorization, right? This legitimization that group A valorizes and ascribes a subordinate group B, right? Which is the Asian Americans, they're subordinate, which is then relative to the subordinate group C, which is blacks. In a cultural and or racial grounds, in order to dominate both groups, right? She's arguing that whites therefore put on, right, this Asian American subordination and this black subordination, right? There's this sort of twofold thing that she's working with, right? In order to dominate both groups. And this domination obviously happens even more so on the black group or group, quote unquote, C. Okay. So you have the white dominant group that constructs this subordination as immutably foreign, right? Unassimilable. with whites, okay? And then in order to ostracize them from the body politic and civic membership. So they're not allowed membership in the society, right? And so what we have is, trying to read this bottom part here, culture is conceived and is a fixed property of social groups, okay? It's a fixed property, it's capital, right? It's an item, right? And so you have blacks that do not have certain things, but also Asians are also not allowed to have certain things, right? Through this sort of social construction, she's trying to break down this man-made, right, human-made concept of race and seeing how it's presented to whites and blacks, and also Asians as well. So I think this is where the diagram helps extremely, okay? Where you have this sort of scale that she's coming up with, right? Where you're having sort of the whites atop, right? Asian Americans are kind of in this in-between area and blacks are at the bottom, right? But then you're also thinking, okay, so your blacks are this insider, which I don't necessarily agree with. I think they are also kind of like a foreign entity as well, which is part of like the problematic sort of nature of kind of putting a scale out when you're trying to understand race, right, and racism, right? But that's part of the exercise that I want us to go through. It's not a foolproof set of understanding racism and race in the United States, but it allows us to recontextualize what it means to be Asian American and how one scholar is sort of breaking it down for us, right? So I think it's maybe an oversimplification, right? But I think there are aspects to the racial triangulation theory that is working towards the understanding of how being Asian American is, but I think she leaves out some important sort of discourse on anti-Blackness as well. Okay. So then she kind of goes into this open racial triangulation, right? And this is some of the theories that is going to allow us to understand like what happened during the 1850s, right? Chinese immigration, right? The domination of whites over the Asians, over the blacks, and how even though there's a similar domination, right? There's similarities in domination, but there's different contextualization, right? You have the Asians as being foreign and inassimilable, right? As opposed to blacks who are, right? If you look at this as an insider, right? And they're still inferior as well, right? Okay, so there's a necessity here with this open racial triangulation. The Chinese were viewed as not suitable for America, but a necessary cheap labor force. And they were portrayed Chinese as backward, alien, despotic, authoritarian. And the term coolie, I think, is an important term that we discussed earlier, right? Where we also link that to slavery, right? But then they were also depicted as systemically different. And so she's arguing that because the coolies were made illegal, right? As opposed to slavery, which is legal for so long, and then all of a sudden became illegal, right? That there's this sort of difference systemically that helps her argument and helps define what she's trying to say is that the Asian American experience is inherently very different than what blacks are, right? The black experience is, right? And so she goes as far as saying that, blacks were, Asians were far more superior than blacks, both in political discourse and in media, right? And this is where I think Kim falls a little bit short, because I think Asians are not superior, right? If anything, it works as a tool of anti-Blackness, right? And I think this is where we need to sort of do a deeper dive into the racial triangulation theory. But I think it's a good way for us to critically inquire and sort of like one of those classic theories that I think when it came out at the time, it was looked at as like something that's phenomenal. Yeah. Okay. So Asian immigrants were seen as both unfit, were the only group in American history to be legally rendered aliens ineligible of citizenship. And then, so there are inconsistencies, right, with how to present Asians within civic life, and you lump them as Black and as non-Black, okay? So again, there's a sort of like shifting in between of like how to like define the new immigrant class. And we talked a little bit about this throughout the term. Okay. So thinking about how, right, non-white testimony was inadmissible or invalid, right? So Chinese could not, right, go against, right, whites in the court of law, right? And, you know, and there was also this sort of middleman, right, role that the Chinese played during the Reconstruction. Okay. And so then you have these court cases that are trying to argue for sort of Asians being, you know, white, or you know, or trying to argue for their sort of citizenship, etc. So, you know, this is where, again, she's arguing that, you know, defining the alien as part of this racial triangle, just keep the alien out, right? And this is why we see this happening in Japanese incarceration, right? So you have these sort of different sort of monumental moments in Asian American history that sort of show how the Asian has been triangulated, right? Treated as an other and an inassimilable other as well. Okay. Then you also have this coded racial triangulation. This is what we're talking about with the model minority, right? And right, and so this is where you have this argument of like reverse discrimination, and you saw how like affirmative action and coming into play, right, where it helped Asians more than it actually helped Blacks, and it worked against Asians, and even though it was helped to design minorities, where it was designed to help minorities, right? And there's conflict over resources like education, jobs, and capital. And so you have Asian American or Asian victims and then Black villains, right? And so again, you see how it sets up this sort of, you know, notion of, again, this divisiveness between the two communities, right? And so you see this with the Black Korean conflict, presenting hardworking immigrants versus Black racial agitators. And this is part of a more complex urban political economy, okay? And this is where we kind of see this happening, where it's kind of like this coded language now of like, oh, the Asian American culture is more superior than Blacks, right? You see this happening, you know, through the model minority, and this is why it's problematic. And this is what she highlights: is the model minority is actually presented in a way that is actually anti-Black, and this is where racial triangulation sort of highlights this understanding. Okay. So you have this sort of table that she presents, right, where you have the model minority versus the underclass, and how there's a, right, you can almost see these as antonyms to each other, right? You have diligence versus laziness, discipline versus lacking discipline, right? And this is part of what we see happening with the model minority and the underclass. Okay. And this is a discussion that I wanted to open it up to the floor with. I know it's a quick lecture, but I really wanted us to get a better understanding of how racial triangulation is one particular theoretical framework that I wanted us to engage with, not necessarily to think of this as being like the end-all be-all understanding of what race means to Asian Americans, but how one scholar was able to sort of come up with an analysis, a critical analysis on what it means to be Asian American, right? You know, there's obviously I think there's an oversimplification that happens here, and I think that's part of the issue with sometimes when coming up with a social theory, where there's a lot more complexity to it. But I want it to be an engaging conversation for us to sort of engage in terms of understanding what you know, what these policies are like, what it's like for these decision makers, these opinion makers, within the U.S., within American society, sort of cultivate, right, a society that is divisive, right, that splits apart minority groups, and how we see that happening with racial triangulation, and how that can be a useful tool for us to sort of unpack, right, the complexity of sort of anti-Blackness in society, the roots of anti-Blackness. And I think this is where I think racial triangulation kind of falls short too, right? Is that there isn't enough on sort of an understanding of like what it means to be a society that is anti-Black. And so, but I think it does highlight at least this notion of, and you see similar theories that come up, like the middleman theory and whatnot. So you do see similar theories like this coming up, where the Asian is kind of, the Asian American in general is kind of placed into different sort of categories. But that's one aspect. And then there's another aspect, right? Asian Americans are a diverse group, right? A lot of the folks are not as successful that we see. If you talk about the Hmong, right? You talk about Southeast Asians, you talk about folks that come over from Vietnam, right? Where's their placement? Because obviously we're talking only in maybe sort of the larger discourse of Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans, right? Who have a history of sort of mobility, maybe class mobility, but then you have another set of new immigrants that come in that sort of do not have that social mobility as well, and are also struggling too. So, right, there's a lot of complex sort of issues that we can unpack, and I want us to have a deeper discussion on like what are some examples that we can think of racial triangulation, and maybe some of the critiques that we can bring up too on racial triangulation too. So I'll stop the recording for now, and then we can jump into discussion.